He paid only $2 for a dying horse, but what that horse gave him back would change everything. The wind over the New Mexico plateau carried more than dust that afternoon. It carried a decision that would rewrite one man's life. When a half-deaf farmer raised his hand at a livestock auction and bought a dying Mustang for $2, everyone thought he'd lost his mind. But under the cracked roof of an old barn, between silence and survival, something extraordinary began to breathe again. The wind had teeth that afternoon. It scraped across the Taos auction yard, carrying the smell of dust, sweat, and worn leather, the kind of smell that clung to old stories. Men stood in loose clusters beneath a tin roof, their hats tilted low, eyes squinting through the amber haze of sun and grit. The loudspeaker crackled, spitting out numbers and half-swallowed words. In the back pen, a thin Mustang swayed on trembling legs. His coat was mottled red and gray, the color of a dying campfire, and every breath rattled through his chest like loose nails in a coffee can. The auctioneer barely bothered with enthusiasm. Next up, lot 37, sick gelding, starting at $5. No one lifted a hand. The crowd had already decided, not worth the feed, not worth the medicine, not worth the trouble. Then a hand rose. It belonged to a man standing alone near the rail, his hat shadowing a face carved by sun and silence. Mason Reed, 46, a farmer from the high plateau, known around town for two things: good hay and bad luck. $2, the auctioneer muttered, half amused. Going once, twice. His gavel fell with a dull clack. Sold. Heads turned, some shaking in disbelief, others smirking. But Mason didn't notice. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, not since the accident with the water pump 2 summers ago. The explosion had left him half-deaf and more withdrawn than ever. He walked toward the pen, each step measured, careful. The Mustang watched him with one weary eye, sides rising shallowly. Up close, Mason could see the ribs pressing against its hide, the cracked hooves, the dry blood caked near the nostrils. He didn't speak. Instead, he extended a slow, open hand. The horse flinched once, twice, then stilled. For a long second, the air stopped moving. Even the dust seemed to hold its breath. The man and the horse stood in a fragile truce, two broken creatures, quietly recognizing each other. The handler looked puzzled. "You sure, Reed? That horse is half a day from the grave." Mason nodded. "Then I'll give him that half." They loaded the Mustang into the back of an old Ford flatbed whose paint had long surrendered to rust. The engine coughed twice before catching. As he climbed into the driver's seat, Mason glanced at the rearview mirror. The horse stood swaying in the trailer, eyes dark, wide, unreadable. The road home stretched 20 miles through open desert, straight line through nothingness. The sun was dropping, turning the mesas into silhouettes and the sand into mirrors of fire. Mason drove slow, watching the horizon blur. He reached to adjust the rear mirror again and found himself watching the horse more than the road, its head lowered, nostrils fluttering with each labored breath. Something about that rhythm stirred a memory, the way his father used to breathe when the asthma got bad, just before the night he didn't wake up. Mason gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Not tonight," he murmured. He wasn't sure if he was talking to the horse or to himself. When he turned off the highway onto the gravel track leading to his ranch, the first stars were already pricking the sky. The old windmill creaked like a ghost, turning in its sleep. Mason parked by the barn, shut off the engine, and sat for a long while in the cooling silence. The ringing in his ears, the constant hum that filled the space where sound should have been, seemed louder than ever. He climbed down, opened the trailer gate. The Mustang hesitated, eyes catching the glint of a lantern Mason had hung by the stall door. "It's all right," Mason said softly, though he couldn't hear his own voice. He gestured slowly, a motion of welcome, and the horse took one uneven step, then another, hooves scraping the wooden ramp. Inside the barn, the smell of old hay and oil greeted them. Mason had cleared the corner stall that morning, not knowing why. Maybe habit, maybe hope. He spread fresh straw, filled a bucket with water from the hand pump. The horse stood trembling, sides heaving, but alive. Mason leaned against the stall rail, watching. "I'll call you River," he said after a moment, "because every river finds its way, even when it's dry." River flicked an ear, as if the name brushed against some buried memory. Mason smiled faintly. He pulled off his gloves, rubbed his palms together, and reached for the small brass bell that hung near the door, a makeshift signal system he'd built after losing most of his hearing. Its faint vibration in his hand was how he measured the wind, the world. Tonight, it trembled gently, like a heartbeat. Outside, the desert exhaled, long and low. The stars shimmered. The air smelled of dust and cold sage. Mason sat on a wooden crate, eyes fixed on the breathing shape in the stall. The Mustang shifted, coughed once, and then, astonishingly, took a mouthful of hay. Slow, uncertain, but a start. Mason let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He thought of the auctioneer's voice fading behind him, the laughter of the crowd, the disbelief. He thought of the 2 crumpled dollar bills still warm from his hand. And then, somewhere deep in the quiet, he felt something move, a thread of purpose stitching itself back into his life. When River raised his head, strands of hay hanging from his mouth, their eyes met again. Not gratitude, not fear. Something simpler, older. Recognition. Morning broke over the plateau like a slow burning ember. The light spilled across the cracked earth, touching the edges of Mason's land with a pale gold that made even the dust shimmer. The silence out here was thick, the kind that pressed against the skin. Mason had learned to read it. The tremor of wind through the tin roof, the way shadows moved before a gust. Silence was not the absence of sound. It was its memory. His ranch had once been full of life. Rows of alfalfa bending in the breeze, horses neighing, his ex-wife's laughter echoing from the porch. Now it was a patchwork of decay. A leaning fence, a half-collapsed shed, the windmill moaning like an old man in his sleep. Mason's world was muted, yet alive in other ways. He could feel the hum of the land through his boots, the pulse of the sky when storms gathered far beyond the mountains. In the barn, River stood like a statue in the morning light that filtered through the slats. His breathing was shallow but steady. Mason filled a pail of water and slid it across the straw. He didn't speak. Instead, he moved slowly, showing his hands before every step. The horse watched him, wary but curious. Trust was a slow harvest. A faint vibration from the porch told Mason that the wind had picked up. The brass wind chime he'd built from old keys and spoons trembled in uneven rhythm, his way of knowing how the world moved outside. Once, that rhythm had been his wife's idea. "If you can't hear the wind," she'd said, "let it dance for you." He could still see her face that day, hair whipping in the sun, her laughter clear as the water they used to pump from the well. But laughter, like water, ran dry when life got too heavy. He turned back to the stall. River was watching him again, eyes dark as wet soil. There was something unsettling in that gaze, not fear exactly, but awareness, like the horse understood the quiet around them. Mason leaned his arms on the rail, studying him. "You and I," he said softly. "We're both learning to live with what's missing." The words were half a confession. The other half, he didn't have the courage to speak. That since the accident, he'd stopped believing in new beginnings. Later that afternoon, Dr. Elena Park's old Subaru rumbled up the dirt road, leaving a trail of dust that glowed behind her like smoke. She stepped out, adjusting her cap against the glare. Mason could see her lips move, but her words reached him only as broken fragments. Infection, weak heart, maybe a week. He nodded, pretending to catch every word. Elena's eyes softened. She'd known him long enough to recognize the effort behind that nod. She handed him a bottle of antibiotics and a short note scrawled with dosage instructions. Mason studied the paper for a moment, then placed it in his shirt pocket, near his chest, like something fragile that might break if left too far away. Inside the barn, Elena ran a gentle hand along River's neck, checking his temperature, his breathing. "He's fighting," she said, her tone quiet but hopeful. "But you need to watch him closely. Sometimes the ones that look strong are the first to give up." Mason watched her lips, catching fragments, filling in the rest with intuition. When she left, he stood in the doorway, watching the dust settle behind her car until it vanished into the horizon. The silence returned. Familiar, almost comforting. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of copper, Mason sat on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold. The wind chime flickered. He stared out toward the barn, where a faint lantern glowed like a heartbeat. Somewhere inside, River shifted, sending a ripple through the straw. Mason couldn't hear it, but he felt it all the same. A small tremor that told him life still moved in that fragile body. He rose, stepped down from the porch, and walked the dirt path toward the barn. The ground crunched beneath his boots, steady and rhythmic. When he reached the door, he rested a hand on the frame. "You keep fighting," he whispered. "That's all either of us can do." River lifted his head at the sight of him, nostrils flaring, eyes catching the dim light. Mason reached out, open-palmed, letting the horse decide. After a long pause, River took a breath that shuddered through his ribs, and stayed still. The barn was quiet, except for the faint rasp of the horse's breathing. Mason leaned against the stall and closed his eyes. He imagined the sound, though he couldn't hear it. The rhythm of survival, soft and stubborn. Outside, the wind picked up again, and the chime answered with a trembling song he could not hear, but could somehow feel in his bones. He smiled, barely. The first in a long time. Tomorrow, he would try to feed River again. Tomorrow, maybe, there would be one less empty place in both of them. By the time dawn folded over the plateau again, frost clung to the grass like a breath that had lost its way home. Mason stepped outside, his coat buttoned to the throat, a faint ribbon of steam rising from his coffee cup. The sky was pale and endless, the kind of silence that pressed so deep it almost rang in the bones. Inside the barn, River stirred weakly, his ribs moving like slow tides. Mason had learned to speak without words. The soft rhythm of his steps, the steady movement of his hands, even the pauses between. All of it told the horse he meant no harm. The first days were a dance of hesitation. River refused the hay, then the water, turning his head away like an old soldier refusing pity. Mason didn't push. He just sat nearby, breathing in rhythm, letting time do what persuasion could not. By mid-morning, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the stillness. Dr. Elena Park's car appeared again, trailing a gray ghost of dust behind it. She climbed out, her stethoscope gleaming briefly in the sun. Mason wiped his hands on his jeans, nodding in quiet greeting. She spoke softly, her tone carrying more comfort than her words. Mason caught fragments. Infections spreading. Lungs. Try another dose. He watched her hands move as she explained, memorizing the gestures. Communication between them had always been half intuition, half trust. She treated his silence the way she treated the animals. Gently, without pity. Elena crouched beside River, pressing the cold disc of her stethoscope to the horse's chest. River shivered, but didn't pull away. "He's weaker," she said, her voice low. "But there's something stubborn in him." Mason read the shape of the word stubborn on her lips and smiled faintly. "Fits right in," he murmured. When she finished, she stood and handed him a small syringe pack and a bottle wrapped in brown paper. "Antibiotics twice a day. Keep him warm. Keep him dry. If he starts breathing faster, call me. Right away." Mason nodded, tapping his temple to show he understood. They stood there a moment longer, two people surrounded by the smell of hay and quiet resilience. Finally, she reached out and rested a hand on Mason's arm. "You're doing good work," she said. He didn't catch the sound, but he saw it in her eyes, the kindness, the faith. Then she was gone, her car shrinking to a speck beyond the ridge. Back inside, Mason prepared the dose the way she'd shown him. He moved with the precision of habit, though inside he could feel the tremor of doubt. River's breath rattled like the old pump before it broke for good. Mason knelt, steadying the horse's neck, and whispered words he couldn't hear but hoped were still prayers. The injection went in clean. River flinched, then stilled. Mason exhaled. He stayed kneeling there, one hand on the animal's shoulder, feeling the slow return of heartbeat under his palm. For the first time, River didn't pull away. That tiny surrender, that acceptance, lit something small but fierce inside Mason. Later, he sat on the porch, watching dusk gather in streaks of copper and violet. He thought about Elena, how she moved through the world with quiet precision, how she didn't flinch at silence. Maybe that was why he trusted her. Maybe that was why he'd begun to trust again at all. When darkness deepened, he returned to the barn with a lantern. River was standing now, head low, tail flicking lazily. The sound of chewing, faint but steady, reached Mason's chest as vibration. It wasn't just the horse eating. It was the world whispering that something could still be saved. Mason leaned against the stall gate, hands wrapped around the lantern's handle. "That's it, boy," he said, smiling at his own shadow on the wall. "That's living." He stayed there long after the lantern burned low, watching the steady rhythm of the horse's breathing, feeling it like a heartbeat in the stillness. The wind outside shifted, brushing against the chimes, and the faint shimmer of movement told Mason that the world, once silent, was beginning to speak again, softly, like the vet who saved lives in whispers. The wind shifted that morning, bringing with it the scent of juniper and wet earth from the hills. Mason stood outside the barn, shoulders heavy beneath his flannel jacket, the taste of coffee gone bitter on his tongue. The night had been long. River had stood most of it, restless, shifting in the straw as if chasing memories of open plains. But when Mason came out at dawn, the horse was calmer, not strong yet, but awake in a new way. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as though the land itself had exhaled. He was cleaning out the stall when he noticed movement near the fence line, a small figure, half hidden by sagebrush. A girl stood there, her dark braid whipping in the wind, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She couldn't have been more than 15. Mason straightened, squinting. She didn't move. The morning light caught on the turquoise beads threaded through her braid, glowing like trapped drops of sky. "You lost?" he called, though he knew she might not hear him. The wind swallowed most things out here. The girl stepped closer, boots crunching the dry dirt. "No," she said finally. Her voice was soft but sure. "I just wanted to see the horse." Mason blinked. "You mean River?" She nodded. "The one from the auction. My uncle works there. Said you bought a dying horse for $2. The words weren't cruel, just matter of fact. Mason shrugged. "Guess I did." The girl studied him, then the horse behind him. "Why?" He hesitated. No one had asked him that, not really. "Because someone had to," he said after a moment. "And I had $2. That answer seemed to satisfy her. She walked to the fence, fingers curling around the weathered wood. River lifted his head, ears twitching. The girl moved slowly, her body relaxed, and the horse didn't shy away. Mason watched, surprised. Usually River turned from strangers, but something about her quiet stillness held him. "My name's Sky," she said, not taking her eyes off the animal. "Sky Yazzie." Her accent carried the music of the Navajo mesas. Round and warm. "My grandmother says animals hear the things people forget how to say." Mason leaned on his shovel. "Your grandmother sounds smart." "She is. She says sometimes they remember us when the world forgets." The wind lifted again, stirring straw across the barn floor. Mason glanced at River. The horse's eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and steady. Sky reached out, palm open, stopping just short of the rail. River's nostrils flared. A single breath bridged the space between them. Mason felt the air change. Thin, charged, tender. The horse didn't move away. He lowered his head until his muzzle hovered just above her hand. For a moment, time folded in on itself. Sky's braid brushed her shoulder. River's tail flicked once. Then he took a deeper breath, the kind that spoke of trust returning after a long exile. "You see?" Sky whispered. "He's listening." Mason swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe he is." They stood there a long while, until the sun climbed higher and the frost melted from the fence posts. When Sky finally turned to leave, she slung her backpack higher. "I'll come by again if that's okay." Mason wanted to say no, to keep this quiet corner of his life untouched. But when he looked back at River, who was still watching the retreating figure with a calm he hadn't shown before, the word wouldn't come. "All right," he said instead, "but only after school." Sky grinned, a flash of white against sun-browned skin. "Deal." She walked down the dirt road, her shadow long across the red earth. Mason stayed where he was, the shovel forgotten, watching her disappear into the shimmer of heat. When he turned back, River was still standing by the fence, head tilted toward the horizon, as though listening to footsteps long after they were gone. Mason reached up and touched the brass chime hanging from the barn door. It quivered in the wind, silent to his ears but alive in his chest. For the first time in months, the silence around him didn't feel like a wall. It felt like space, something big enough to hold new beginnings. That night, as the desert cooled and stars began to bloom, Mason wrote on a scrap of paper the name Sky. He pinned it above River's stall. Maybe, he thought, every story needed another voice. Inside the barn, the horse exhaled deeply and settled down in the straw, the sound, or what Mason imagined as sound, steady and real. Outside, the chimes shimmered again, catching the wind that carried both loss and something dangerously close to hope. The sky that afternoon turned the color of old iron. Clouds gathered low over the mesa, their bellies swollen with dust instead of rain. Mason felt the shift before he saw it. The tremor in the wind chime, the way the horseshoe nails hanging from his porch began to rattle like distant bones. Storms on the plateau came fast, with no warning and no mercy. Inside the barn, River was uneasy. He paced the stall, nostrils flaring, hooves thudding against the floorboards. The air carried the electric scent of ozone and fear. Mason set down his tools and moved toward the stall, palms open, slow and deliberate. "Easy, boy," he said, though he couldn't hear his own voice. The horse's eyes flashed white. Thunder rolled somewhere far beyond his perception, but he saw it. The flicker of light, the vibration through the wood. Then a sharp gust tore through the barn's half-closed doors, scattering straw like yellow sparks. River reared, slamming his chest into the gate. Mason lunged forward, heart pounding, but the horse was lost to instinct now, trapped between panic and memory. And then came another sound Mason couldn't hear, the tearing moan of wind against tin, the metallic scream of the roof lifting. He felt it in his ribs, a deep pulse, and for a moment he was back in that night years ago, the night the pump exploded, the night he'd lost his hearing. He remembered the flash of light, the roar that ripped his world apart, the silence that followed like punishment. "Hey!" a voice cut through his memory. Mason turned to see Sky sprinting toward the barn, her hair whipping like black smoke. "I saw it coming from the ridge," she shouted, ducking inside. He tried to wave her back, but she was already beside him, eyes wide, breathing hard. "He's scared," she said, pointing to River. "He doesn't know where the noise ends." Mason nodded, understanding even if he couldn't hear. He stepped closer to the horse, hands lifted, forming the shapes he'd taught Sky the week before. The slow sweep of fingers meaning stay. The soft downward motion meaning breathe. River was trembling, wild-eyed, his whole body a coil of flight. Mason pressed his palm flat against the horse's neck, feeling the frantic pulse beneath the hide. "Look at me," he whispered. "Look here." For a breathless moment, River didn't move. Then his gaze shifted, finding Mason's face. The wind screamed again, rattling the barn's frame, but the horse didn't bolt. He blinked once, twice, as if seeing something familiar in the chaos. Mason kept his palm steady, breathing in rhythm with the trembling body beneath it. In, out, in, out. Sky stood frozen nearby, watching the two of them, man and horse, locked in some silent language older than words. When the storm hit full force, it came not with rain but with dust, red and choking, swirling through every crack in the boards. Mason felt it grit against his teeth. The chime outside clattered wildly, its motion visible through the open door, swinging like a heart caught in panic. But inside the stall, something changed. River lowered his head. The whites of his eyes disappeared. His breathing slowed until Mason could feel the steadiness returning under his hand. Sky's voice came small through the din. "He's listening to you." Mason shook his head. "No," he said. "He's remembering how." Minutes dragged into an hour. The storm raged, then began to die, the sky bleeding from rust to gray. When the first calm swept in, Mason stepped back, his shoulders coated in dust. River stood still, chest rising slow, like a creature who'd learned to trust the dark. Sky leaned on the stall, her face streaked with grit. "How did you do that?" she asked. Mason thought for a moment, then signed the word he'd shown her earlier. "Breathe." He touched his chest, then the horse's. "Same air," he said simply. "That's all it is?" Outside, the clouds began to break apart. Shafts of evening light spilled across the field, catching on the wet sheen of mud and debris. The air smelled of iron and rain that never came. Mason walked to the door, looking out at what the storm had left. Scattered branches, broken fence posts, the world rearranged but still standing. Behind him, Sky's soft laughter broke through the stillness. "He's eating," she said. Mason turned. River had lowered his head into the pile of hay, pulling at it slowly, stubbornly. He felt the relief rush through him like warmth after frostbite. "Good," he murmured. "That's good." They spent the next hour repairing the doors, stacking fallen tools, setting the barn to rights. When Sky finally left, Mason watched her fade down the dirt road, her silhouette framed against the fading orange horizon. He returned to River's stall one last time. The horse lifted his head, straw hanging from his mouth, and Mason couldn't help but laugh, or what passed for laughter, a quiet puff of air that felt like gratitude. He reached out and brushed dust from River's mane. "You did all right," he said. "You stayed." The horse blinked, slow and deliberate, and Mason thought he saw in those dark eyes the faintest reflection of his own. Tired, weathered, but still alive. Outside, the wind died completely. The chime swayed once, twice, then fell still. Mason stood there in the sudden stillness, the aftertaste of fear still sharp in his mouth, but his chest full of something new, something steady and wordless, like peace that had been waiting for its turn to speak. The storm left behind a strange stillness. The air the next morning felt washed clean, but the ground bore scars of what had passed. Broken branches, half-buried fence wire, sand packed tight into corners of the barn. Mason woke early, drawn outside by habit more than rest. The first thing he saw was River standing calm, a faint shimmer of dust still clinging to his coat. The horse's eyes met his, steady now, and for the first time since the auction, Mason felt he wasn't looking at a dying animal, but at a survivor. He shoveled debris from the yard, boots crunching over the hardened earth. Each movement left a trail of fresh imprints, a quiet record of returning order. Sky arrived a little after sunrise, her braid dusted with sand, her hands carrying a thermos that smelled of sage tea. "Grandmother said storms take away what's weak," she said, handing it to Mason. "What's left can grow again." He nodded, though he didn't know if he believed it. His body ached, but there was a pull in his chest that felt almost like gratitude. Together, They began cleaning the paddock, piling wrecked boards into neat stacks. River followed their motion with mild curiosity, every so often stepping closer, his ears twitching at Sky's soft hum of an old song. When the barn was back in order, Mason brought out a small slate board and a stick of chalk. He sketched a rough outline of a hand, palm open, fingers spread. "Sign," he said. Sky watched, him puzzled. "Like a word?" He nodded. "No sound, just shape." He moved his hand slowly through the air, repeating the gesture. Palm down, open fingers, slow breath out. River watched, head tilted slightly. Mason tried it again, then again. The third time, River's ears flicked forward. His body shifted, one hoof scraping the ground. Sky's eyes widened. "He knows," she whispered. "He remembers from yesterday." Mason gave a small smile. "Maybe he just likes patterns. Maybe that's what language really is." He showed her 2 more signs, one for stay, the other for trust. Sky imitated each movement, her fingers uncertain but earnest. They practiced until the sunlight slanted low and long through the doorway, turning the air gold. That evening, as they rested on the porch steps, Rory Blake drove by on his way to town. His pickup slowed when he saw Mason and the girl. He leaned out the window, camera slung across his neck. "Hey, Reed, that the horse?" Mason nodded. Rory whistled. "Damn, he looks better. Mind if I take a picture?" Mason hesitated. Sky glanced at him. "It might help," she said. "People should see." Rory parked and stepped into the yard, moving with the easy confidence of someone used to capturing fleeting things. He crouched near the fence, camera raised. Mason and Sky stood beside River, the horse motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Rory snapped several shots, then lowered the camera. "You don't see moments like this much," he said. "It's got something real." He offered to send Mason a copy, but Mason just waved him off with a faint smile. He didn't need to see it. He was living it. That night, after Sky left, Mason fed River the last of the alfalfa hay. The horse chewed slowly, his breath soft and steady. Mason wiped his hands on his jeans and glanced toward the porch. The chime was still, barely catching the wind. He thought about the word trust, and how fragile it was, how hard it was to rebuild once broken. Yet somehow, here it was, taking shape again, quiet, but undeniable. Later, as the stars came out, Mason walked back to the barn one last time. He knelt in the dirt beside the stall, tracing the signs they'd practiced earlier. Stay. Breathe. Safe. Each one drawn with a fingertip, each one vanishing as the wind moved across it. Behind him, River lowered his head, brushing Mason's shoulder with a rough, warm breath. It was the gentlest acknowledgement, but it filled the silence completely. Mason didn't move. He just closed his eyes and let the air settle around them, full of the smell of hay and dust and life returning. The next morning, when he stepped outside, he saw that the wind had erased all the chalk and marks from the night before. The ground looked untouched, except for one thing. Beside the stall, the horse's hoofprint overlapped one of his palm marks, pressed deep into the soil. A single shared impression, captured in the dust. Mason smiled. Maybe some things didn't need to last to mean something. Maybe the wind could carry them far enough. He turned toward the rising sun, shoulders straightening as light spilled over the fields. Behind him, River neighed softly. a low, rasping sound Mason couldn't quite hear, but felt resonate through the ground like a heartbeat. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The picture Rory took spread faster than Mason could have imagined. Within a week, it found its way from a local paper's community column to a viral post online titled, "The Farmer Who Spoke to His Horse with His Hands." Mason didn't have social media. Skye showed him on her phone one afternoon, the screen glowing like a small fire between them. He watched the image, him standing beside River, hand raised mid-gesture, the light pouring in through the barn door like something sacred. He didn't know what to feel. Skye grinned. "People love it. They're saying it's beautiful." Mason nodded, but his stomach tightened. Beauty had a cost out here, and attention even more so. He'd spent years keeping the world at arm's length. Now the world was reaching back. By the end of that week, 3 people had driven up his dirt road to ask about the horse. 2 offered money. One man from Santa Fe with a heavy gold watch said he'd pay $1,500 on the spot. Mason leaned against the fence, arms crossed, and told him politely to get off his land. "He's not for sale," he said. The man laughed. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Reed." But he left, his tires spitting gravel like an insult. When he told Skye, she frowned. Why would they want him now? He's just a horse. "He's a story," Mason said. "People always want to own a story once it means something." That night, the ranch felt different. Not dangerous, but exposed. The wind didn't sound the same. Mason sat at his kitchen table, flipping through a pile of unpaid bills. Feed costs, vet supplies, a letter from the bank reminding him the mortgage grace period was ending. He rubbed the heel of his hand against his eyes. 2 years ago, when his hearing failed, he'd sold half the cattle. Then the drought came. Then the divorce papers. Mercy, it seemed, always demanded payment in full. When the knock came, he almost didn't hear it. Dr. Elena Park stood on the porch, coat dusted with road grit. "Evening," she said when he opened the door. "You look tired." "Work'll do that." She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, her eyes scanning the sparse room, the photographs turned face down, the silence that pressed close as walls. "You've seen the news?" "Skye showed me." "Then you know what's coming. People are going to want a piece of this, of you. Be careful." He studied her face, the fine lines near her eyes. "You think I can't handle a few reporters?" "I think you're carrying too much already," she said gently, "and I think that horse means more to you than you're ready to admit." He didn't answer. The soundless pause between them stretched until it hurt. Finally, Elena sighed and reached into her bag. She handed him another bottle of medication. "For River. The infection's fading, but finish the course. Hope's a fragile thing. You don't stop halfway." When she left, the night swallowed the sound of her tires. Mason stayed by the window, looking at the barn lantern burning dim through the fog. Later, when he went to check on River, Skye was already there. She sat cross-legged on the hay, her hand resting lightly on the horse's muzzle. River was calmer than usual, chewing lazily, his breath misting in the chill air. She didn't look up when Mason entered. "He's different now," she said softly. "He doesn't look scared anymore." Mason knelt beside her. "Neither do you." She smiled without turning. "My grandma says fear leaves when someone listens long enough. Maybe you listened." He almost told her he couldn't even hear his own name half the time, but he didn't. Instead, he said, "Maybe we both did." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was companionable, a shared language that required no translation. Mason watched River's slow breathing and thought about all the things he hadn't saved. His father, his marriage, the ranch slipping inch by inch from under him. But maybe saving one thing, one horse, was enough. Still, reality waited. At dawn, the mail truck left another envelope on his gatepost. Inside was a final notice from the bank. He read it twice, then folded it neatly and slid it into his pocket. Skye found him later repairing a section of fence. "Something wrong?" she asked. "Nothing new," he said. "Just the world reminding me it's still turning." That afternoon, Rory drove back, dust trailing behind his truck like smoke. "Reed," he said, climbing out, "you've got yourself a fan club. I got calls from Denver. Even a ranch magazine in Texas wants an interview." Mason shook his head. "Not interested." Rory frowned. "Look, I get it. You don't want attention. But stories like this, they matter. People see hope in it." "Hope doesn't pay for feed," Mason said. Rory hesitated, then pulled a check from his jacket. "I sold a few prints. Thought you should have a cut." Mason stared at the number. $250. Enough to buy medicine and hay for a month. He took the check slowly. "I don't like charity." "It's not charity," Rory said. "It's what happens when a picture makes people care." When the photographer left, Mason looked across the paddock. Skye was brushing River's coat, humming the same soft tune she always did. The light around them shimmered like heat, fragile and gold. He tucked the check into his pocket, next to the folded bank notice. Then he whispered to the air, "Mercy sure charges interest." That night, as the sun bled out behind the mesas, he sat on the porch steps with River's halter in his hands. The leather was cracked, worn smooth where the horse's skin had rubbed against it. He thought about selling the old truck, about taking another loan, about the years he'd spent chasing one more chance. Inside the barn, River stomped once, a solid sound he could feel through the floorboards. Mason looked up, toward the dim glow through the wood slats, and something in him steadied. Maybe, he thought, some debts weren't meant to be paid with money. Maybe they were paid in hours kept, in breaths shared, in the simple act of showing up every single day. He stood, slipped the halter over his shoulder, and walked toward the barn. Behind him, the wind rose again, brushing the chimes until they quivered like small hearts. He couldn't hear their music, but he could feel it vibrate against the night, reminding him that mercy, like love, was never free, but always worth the price. Winter's first breath slid down from the Sangre de Cristo mountains, cold enough to sting but clear enough to make the stars burn brighter. Mason woke before dawn, as he always did, when the horizon was still bruised purple, and the world belonged to whoever could bear the quiet. The barn smelled of hay and frost. River stood waiting, his coat thickening against the cold, eyes soft but alert. There was a steadiness to him now, something grounded that hadn't been there before. Mason poured warm water into a bucket, watching the steam curl like smoke. "Morning, old boy," he said, his voice more habit than sound. River's ears flicked as if he understood the rhythm, if not the words. Skye arrived soon after, her breath fogging in front of her. She carried a folded blanket patterned in red and turquoise. "Grandma made this," she said, spreading it over River's back. "She said warmth keeps hope alive." Mason smiled, adjusting the edges so it sat evenly. "She's right," he signed, fingers moving slowly through the cold air. Skye caught the motion and mirrored it. Awkward, but determined. She had picked up some of the gestures he used with River, and now she wanted to learn more. They spent that morning outside, practicing signs as the sun climbed above the hills. "Show me again," Sky said. Mason repeated the gesture for trust, then for breathe. "Every time we use our hands," he told her, "we make silence mean something." River watched, ears turning toward each flick of movement. When Mason raised his palm for stay, the horse froze. When he lowered his hand for easy, River exhaled, his muscles relaxing. Sky laughed quietly. "It's like he understands better than most people do." "Maybe because he doesn't expect words to fix everything," Mason said. "He just listens." By afternoon, the air had warmed enough for them to lead River out into the paddock. Mason unlatched the gate, and the horse stepped onto open ground for the first time since the storm. The red dirt was soft under his hooves, a little uneven but forgiving. Sky walked beside him, her hand resting on the halter. River's nostrils flared, catching the scent of wind, the faint trace of snow in the distance. When Mason signed run, River hesitated, glancing back. Then, as if remembering something buried deep in muscle memory, he trotted forward, mane rippling. Mason and Sky stood still, watching him move. Awkward at first, then smoother, faster, until the Mustang was a blur of motion against the fading sun. The sound of his hooves was faint to Mason, almost imagined, but the vibration traveled through the ground, through his boots, up into his chest. It felt like a heartbeat returning. "Look at him," Sky said. "He's free." "Not free," Mason corrected softly. "He's home." River slowed after a few laps, snorting clouds of steam, then returned to them on his own. Mason raised both hands, palms up, the sign for enough. The horse stopped, head lowering. "See?" Mason said to Sky. "He's speaking back now." They lingered in the paddock until the light bled into dusk. Rory's truck appeared again, headlights flickering as it climbed the hill. He leaned out the window, waving. "He looks incredible," he said. "I posted the new photo. People are asking if they can donate to help with feed costs." Mason frowned, brushing dust from his gloves. "I didn't ask for that." "Doesn't matter," Rory said. "Sometimes help shows up whether we want it or not. You might as well let people care." Sky grinned at him. "Maybe River's famous now." Mason chuckled under his breath. "He doesn't know it, and that's what makes him better than the rest of us." That night, after Sky went home, Mason sat at the kitchen table with a half-empty cup of coffee and the laptop Rory had left him. He opened the link to the article, its headline bold and simple. "The Silent Farmer and His Mustang Who Speaks with Hands." He scrolled through pictures. River standing proud in the sunset, Sky laughing beside him, Mason's own face caught mid-gesture. He read a few of the comments, people from faraway places saying things like, "This made me believe in kindness again," and "Sometimes the world just needs quiet." He closed the screen before finishing, but the words stayed with him. Maybe it wasn't such a bad thing, being seen for something that wasn't loss. Before turning in, he stepped out onto the porch. The night smelled of cedar smoke and frost. From the barn came the faint thud of River shifting in his stall. Mason lifted his hands in the dark, forming the shape of thank you. He didn't know if he meant it for the horse, for the people who cared, or for whatever invisible force had kept him alive this long. When he went back inside, he noticed Sky's blanket hanging neatly over a chair. Its colors caught the lamplight. Warm reds, deep blues, a pattern that looked like motion frozen mid-air. He traced the stitches with his fingers, feeling the rhythm of them, the quiet persistence. Tomorrow, they would start again. More signs, more trust, more of that wordless faith that stitched the broken pieces together. Mason smiled to himself. Maybe silence wasn't a punishment after all. Maybe it was a language waiting to be learned. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the chimes into motion. Their vibration passed through the walls, gentle and familiar, the same rhythm as rivers breathing in the dark. The first sign of trouble came not with smoke, but with wind. It rolled in dry and sharp from the west, carrying the smell of something distant yet familiar. Scorched cedar, burnt dust, the faint memory of heat. By mid-afternoon, the air shimmered, and the sky turned the color of brass. Mason was in the paddock mending a fence post when he saw the haze rising above the ridge, thin at first, then thickening into a low, crawling cloud. Skye noticed it too. "That's not just dust," she said, shading her eyes. "It's fire." Mason squinted toward the horizon. The wind chime on the porch trembled, though no sound reached him. He could see its motion, violent and uneven. Every instinct told him the valley was in danger. "Help me get River inside," he said, signing the words more than speaking them. Together they led the horse to the barn, the animal's nostrils flaring, sensing the panic in the air long before flames were visible. By the time they shut the doors, the wind had turned cruel. Dust lashed the windows, turning the world outside into a blur of copper light. Mason tried to listen for sirens, for engines, but all he had was silence. It made the danger worse, like fighting a ghost you couldn't see. Skye's phone buzzed. She read the alert out loud. "Wildfire on the West Ridge, spreading toward the highway." Her hands shook. "That's not far from the school bus route." Mason froze. The school bus had left town only 20 minutes ago, the same road that cut past his land before turning down into the valley. He looked at Skye, and in that single moment of understanding, they both moved. He grabbed River's halter and swung open the barn door. The heat outside slapped them in the face. The fire wasn't close yet, but the wind was feeding it fast. Mason could see the faint orange glow flickering across the mesa, like lightning that refused to fade. "You're not thinking," Skye began. He was. "Get your truck ready," he said. "If the bus gets caught in that smoke, they won't see the road." Within minutes, they reached the ridge where the dirt road met the valley floor. The wind whipped sand across their faces, and the smoke was thick now, curling low and choking the air. Through it, Mason spotted flashing hazard lights. The bus stopped halfway down the slope. The driver was outside, waving frantically. Mason couldn't hear her words, but he could see her fear. Behind, the glass, small faces pressed against windows, pale and motionless. The wind roared, scattering ash like snow. Mason motioned to Skye, then to River. He stepped forward, tugging gently on the halter. "We're going," he said, though his voice was lost in the storm. The horse resisted for a moment, then pushed forward, trusting the hand it knew. They advanced slowly, Mason leading, Skye following with wet rags over her mouth and nose. When they reached the bus, the driver's relief was immediate. "We can't move," she shouted. "The road's blocked by a fallen branch. The smoke's too thick. The kids are panicking." Mason gestured for her to keep everyone calm. He turned to Skye, motioning for her to bring the water from the truck. Together, they soaked the towels and handed them through the windows. Then, using his hatchet, Mason cleared the branch. His lungs burned with every breath, his vision blurred with sweat. The wind shifted again, harder this time, pushing the smoke downward. River whinnied, stamping the ground, but didn't flee. Mason pressed his forehead to the horse's neck, mouthing a silent plea. "Stay with me." And River did. When the children filed out, coughing and crying, the Mustang stood between them and the smoke, his body broad and calm, blocking the wind like a living shield. The smallest child clung to Sky's arm. "Is the horse scared?" the boy asked, voice shaking. Sky looked up at River, who stood unmoving, eyes fixed on the horizon. "No," she said softly. "He's brave enough for all of us." With the road cleared, they led the bus down to safer ground near the dry creek bed. When the last of the kids were loaded back in, Mason leaned against the fender, coughing hard, soot streaking his face. Sky handed him water, her eyes wet with relief. "You could have died," she said. He shook his head. "We all could have." The bus drove off toward town, its red taillights vanishing into the smoke. Mason stood there a while, hand resting on River's shoulder, feeling the tremor of exhaustion under the horse's skin. The fire line glowed faintly on the horizon, but it was slowing now, the wind finally shifting north. When they got back to the ranch, the stars were dimmed by haze, but the worst had passed. Sky sank onto the porch steps, covering her face with her hands. Mason tied River's lead rope loosely and poured a bucket of water. The horse drank deep, then lifted his head, exhaling a long, low breath that sounded almost human. "You saved them," Sky said, looking up. Mason wiped his brow with a dusty sleeve. "He did," he replied. "I just followed." They sat in silence as the night cooled, the wind finally soft again. Ash drifted through the air like snow, settling across the paddock and roof. The land smelled burned, but alive. When Mason finally turned to go inside, he paused by River's stall. The horse's eyes caught the lantern light, calm and knowing. Mason raised his hand in their shared sign. "Breathe." River mirrored the motion, dipping his head once. That small exchange undid something in Mason he hadn't realized was still wound tight. He reached out, fingers brushing the warm hide. "You did good," he whispered. "Real good." He stood there for a long time, his palm against the living proof that mercy wasn't weakness. It was strength, quiet, deliberate, and unshakable, like a horse that refused to run from fire. The fire was gone by morning, leaving a land that looked both wounded and reborn. Smoke still lingered along the ridge, faint as breath, and the hills wore a thin veil of gray. Mason stood at the edge of his property, the cold biting through his jacket, watching sunlight creep across the scorched fields. The valley had survived. Barely. He could see the blackened tips of grass, the outlines of burned sage, the silent miracle of his fence still standing. River grazed nearby, his coat streaked with soot. Sky had come at dawn to check on him, bringing a loaf of bread and a tired smile. "Grandma said the wind spared this place because you had faith," she said. Mason looked out over the fields and thought of how little faith he'd had left before this horse arrived. "Maybe the wind just owed me a favor," he said. Later that day, a shiny black SUV pulled into the yard. Clean, polished, so foreign against the dust, it looked like it belonged to another world. A man stepped out wearing a suit that had never known wind or dirt. "Mr. Reed?" His voice was smooth, practiced. "Marcus Webb. Denver Development Group. Mason nodded cautiously. You're far from Denver. I make the drive for good investments, Webb replied, glancing around. You've got quite the story here. The deaf farmer and his miracle horse. Inspiring. And this land? 800 acres of untouched potential. My company's building a resort project along the foothills. We'd like to buy you out. Mason said nothing, waiting for the rest. Webb smiled like a man who always gets what he wants. 400,000. Enough to clear your debts, retire comfortably. We'll even move the horse for you. He can graze in greener pastures. Skye, who had been cleaning the trough, froze. You can't sell it, she said. This place, it's where he got better. Webb ignored her. You've done something special, Mr. Reed. But this land could mean more if you let it evolve. Progress is a kind of mercy, too. Mason's jaw tightened. Progress for who? For everyone, Webb replied smoothly. Jobs, tourism, new energy in the valley. Don't mistake sentiment for success. You can't save the world with good intentions and a horse. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Mason turned to River, who was watching them quietly, the faint wind tugging his mane. He remembered the nights of feeding, the storms, the trembling trust that had taken root between them. The land wasn't just dirt and grass anymore. It was memory, pulse, and purpose. I'll need to think on it, Mason said. Webb handed him a folder thick with papers. Of course, but the offer expires Friday. After that, the project moves elsewhere. He extended a hand. Mason shook it, though it felt wrong, a gesture that didn't belong in this place. When the SUV disappeared down the road, the dust settled like an afterthought. Skye looked at Mason, eyes burning. You're not really thinking about it, are you? He didn't answer. Instead, he went to the barn, closing the door behind him. The quiet there felt honest. River raised his head as Mason entered, the light from the small window catching the silver along his muzzle. Mason leaned against the rail, pulling the contract from his pocket. The words blurred together, numbers, signatures, promises of comfort that didn't feel like freedom. He thought about how tired he was, of struggling, of counting dollars, of pretending the ranch could ever be what it was. He looked at River and saw the truth. The horse didn't know about money, banks, or deadlines. He only knew the language of staying, the small act of presence that asked for nothing but gave everything. When night came, Skye returned with her grandmother's truck. Grandma says you can't sell something that's already holy, she said, handing him a thermos of soup. Mason smiled weakly. Your grandma's got away with words. The next day passed slow. He worked the fields, fixed a fence that didn't need fixing, fed River an extra measure of hay. Each task was a way of thinking without thinking. When dusk arrived, he sat on the porch steps, the contract folded in his hands. Rory stopped by after sunset. Heard you got an offer, he said. Mason nodded. Rory looked around, his camera hanging loose. I hope you don't take it. The world's got plenty of rich men and not nearly enough people like you. Mason didn't reply. He just watched the stars appear, faint sparks against the deepening blue. Sometimes, he said finally, doing the right thing doesn't pay the bills. Rory crouched, picking up a bit of ash from the ground. Maybe not, but it pays something else. When the photographer left, Mason walked to the barn one last time. River stood by the gate, waiting. Mason touched his neck, the warmth grounding him. If I sold this place, he said quietly, I'd be selling us too. The horse leaned into his hand, eyes closing. In that gesture was an answer he didn't need translated. By morning, Mason had made his decision. He signed nothing, mailed nothing. The papers went into the wood stove, curling and blackening until only ash remained. When Skye arrived, he handed her the check Rory had given weeks before. "For feed," he said. "We'll keep going as long as we can." Skye grinned, a little breathless. "So you're staying?" Mason looked around, at the fields, scarred but standing, at the barn that still smelled of hay and life, at the horse who'd carried him through fire and silence. "Yeah," he said. "I'm staying." As the sun rose, painting the valley gold, River stepped forward and nudged his shoulder. Mason laughed, deep and quiet, the sound of someone who had finally stopped running. The wind stirred the chimes on the porch, their motion gentle, steady. This time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Autumn came early to the high desert that year. The air thinned, carrying the scent of fallen cottonwood leaves and distant rain. The fields glowed in shades of gold and rust, and the mountains stood blue and sharp against the horizon. Mason had always liked this season, its quiet honesty, its way of preparing for what's next without complaint. But this autumn felt different. The ranch wasn't dying anymore. It was breathing. The story of River had reached farther than any of them expected. The local news picked it up, then a regional magazine. A reporter from Vermont wrote to Rory, asking if Mason would speak at a conference about animal therapy and resilience. "They want you and the horse there," Rory said, holding the letter out. "People think what you're doing could help others." Mason stared at the words, unsure how to answer. He wasn't a speaker. He barely spoke at all these days, at least not in ways the world understood. "They don't need me," he said finally. "They need what he taught us." Skye, who was leaning on the stall door, grinned. "Then we'll show them. Not talk, show." A month later, they made the long drive east. The truck rattled over miles of open highway, the horse trailer humming behind them. Mason sat behind the wheel, eyes fixed on the road, the endless stretch of red and gray blurring into the horizon. Skye dozed beside him, her hand resting on the camera Rory had loaned her to document the trip. "You think River will like Vermont?" she asked sleepily. "He'll like the grass," Mason said, smiling faintly. "And the quiet. Quiet's the same everywhere." When they arrived, the air was different, wet, full of pine and soil, and the sound of water moving somewhere unseen. The trees blazed with color, each leaf a small fire of its own. The conference grounds were a renovated farm, white fences and red barns that gleamed under soft rain. People gathered to watch as Mason unloaded River, the Mustang stepping down the ramp with the slow grace of someone who remembered both wildness and trust. They were greeted by Dr. Harris, a therapist who ran programs for children with communication challenges. He had kind eyes and a tired smile. "Mr. Reed," he said, shaking Mason's hand, "your story's done something none of our case studies could. It's made people believe in stillness again." Mason wasn't sure what to say. He nodded once, glancing at River, who had already drawn a small crowd of curious onlookers. Skye stood nearby, camera in hand, watching every motion. "He doesn't like noise," Mason warned gently. "We'll keep it calm," Dr. Harris said. The demonstration was simple. A small group of parents and children gathered near the paddock, their voices soft, their movements cautious. One boy stood apart, his shoulders hunched, fingers twisting the hem of his sweater. His mother whispered that he hadn't spoken since his father died 6 months earlier. Mason nodded and motioned for the boy to approach. River stood still, his breath visible in the cool air. Mason lifted his hands, slow, deliberate, forming the signs for easy and safe. The horse blinked, responding with the faintest dip of his head. Mason turned to the boy, repeating the same motions. The child hesitated, then mirrored him clumsily, palms shaking. River took a single step forward. The boy froze. Then, slowly, he reached out. His fingers brushed the horse's muzzle. For a heartbeat, the world held still. The crowd, the wind, even time itself. Then the boy whispered, so faint Mason almost didn't believe he'd heard it. "Warm." His mother gasped, covering her mouth. Sky's camera clicked, catching the moment as sunlight broke through the clouds. Mason stood beside them, heart heavy in his chest, every sound replaced by feeling. Afterward, Dr. Harris approached, eyes bright. "You realize what just happened?" Mason nodded. He heard the wind. That evening, they were invited to speak on stage. Sky did most of the talking, her voice steady as she described their journey. Mason stood beside her, hands clasped, River grazing behind them. When the applause came, it was thunderous, though Mason couldn't hear it. He only saw faces lit with hope, and that was enough. Later, in the quiet of the stables, Sky turned to him. "I think you changed more lives than you'll ever know." Mason smiled. "No," he said, stroking River's neck. "He did. I just listened." The next morning, frost glazed the grass outside the barn. Mason stood watching his breath mingle with the horses, the rhythm perfectly matched. He remembered something Sky's grandmother once said, that the wind carries every voice ever spoken. It just takes time to return the ones we need to hear. When the truck finally turned west for home, the Vermont trees bowed in the breeze, their leaves scattering like small prayers. Mason didn't look back. He didn't need to. The wind would speak for them now. As they crossed the state line, Sky rolled down her window, letting the cold rush in. "What do you think the wind's saying?" she asked. Mason glanced at the mirror, where River's reflection moved gently in the trailer, calm and unafraid. "It's saying we did all right," he said, and for the first time in years, he could almost hear it. Winter returned to the Taos Plateau with a calm that felt earned. The sky hung low and clear, the light thin as silk. Frost jeweled every fence, line, and the morning smelled of cedar smoke and snow. Mason's ranch, once a forgotten patch of land clinging to debt and silence, had changed. It was still quiet, still remote, but now that quiet carried warmth, not emptiness. The new sign hung at the gate. River Hands, a quiet horsemanship program. Rory had carved it himself from a slab of local pine, each letter deep and deliberate. Below it, a smaller line read, "For those who listen beyond sound." Every week, a small group arrived, children, veterans, people who carried invisible wounds. They came not for miracles, but for stillness. Sky ran the sessions, her patience blending with the easy rhythm of River's movements. Mason mostly watched, fixing fences, mixing feed, or mending saddles in the background. Yet somehow, everyone who came found their way to him. One afternoon, a man from Albuquerque stood by the paddock, staring at River with the blank eyes of someone learning to feel again. "I haven't spoken much since Afghanistan," he told Mason quietly. Too much noise in my head. Mason pointed to the horse. He knows that kind of noise, he said, signing the word breathe. The man followed the motion clumsily, repeating it once, then again. River exhaled, and the man smiled for the first time in years. That was enough. Sky had grown too. She was taller now, her voice steadier when she spoke to the visitors. Her grandmother still sent herbs and stories, sometimes riding out on Sundays with a basket of bread. You made a church without walls, she told Mason once. The wind carries your prayers better that way. Mason never argued. He didn't need to. He felt the truth of it every morning when he stepped into the barn and saw River waiting. The horse's muzzle had turned silver around the edges, a sign of time passing gently. When Mason touched his neck, the same steady calm moved through him as it had the day they first met. In early spring, a letter arrived from Dr. Harris in Vermont. Your story continues to ripple outward, it said. We're developing new therapy programs based on your methods. You've taught us that communication isn't about sound. It's about presence. Mason read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the old wooden box where he kept his wife's letters. Later that week, Sky brought a group of children from a nearby school for a tour. They moved carefully, their laughter carrying across the fields. Mason stood by the porch, watching them discover the barn, the hay bales, the small corral where River waited. One of the children, a girl no older than 8, approached him shyly. She held out a drawing, a horse standing beside a man, both surrounded by wind. Across the bottom, she had written, "Thank you for teaching quiet." Mason took the paper in both hands. For a moment, his vision blurred, the colors bleeding into each other. He knelt, smiling. "You're welcome," he said softly, though the sound barely reached his own ears. That evening, as the sun fell behind the mountains, Sky found him sitting by the paddock, River's head resting on his shoulder. The sky blazed orange and violet, the same colors that had painted every ending he'd ever known. "You ever think about how far we've come?" she asked. Mason nodded. "Sometimes I think it's not me that came this far. It's the world that finally caught up." She laughed quietly, and they sat in comfortable silence. The wind picked up, threading through the chimes that hung from the porch. Mason could feel their faint vibration in his chest, a rhythm he'd come to know by heart. When darkness deepened, he rose to make one last round through the barn. The stalls glowed softly under lantern light. River shifted, turning toward him, eyes glinting like old copper. Mason ran a hand down his muzzle. "We did all right," he whispered. "Didn't we?" The horse exhaled, a long, even breath that fogged the cool air between them. It was answer enough. Mason lingered there, remembering that first day at the auction. The smell of dust, the weight of pity, the foolish hope that had driven him to raise his hand for $2. Back then, he thought he was buying mercy for a dying creature. He hadn't known he was buying a second chance for himself. Outside, the moon rose full over the plateau, silvering the fields and the fence lines. The ranch lay quiet but alive, pulsing with the invisible heartbeat of every life that had passed through it. Mason walked back to the house, the boards creaking softly under his boots. Before he went inside, he turned once more toward the paddock. River stood framed by moonlight, still and steady, the desert wind rippling through his mane. Mason lifted his hand, signing the simple word they'd shared from the start. "Breathe." River dipped his head in reply. The chimes stirred again, a soundless song filling the night. And in that silence, Mason heard everything he'd ever needed to hear. "Before you go, tell me what you felt when you heard Mason's story," If you believe kindness can still change a life, even in silence, comment 1 below. And if this story touched your heart, comment 0, so I'll know you're still here, listening. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because next time, I'll tell you another story where a single act of compassion between a person and an animal changes everything once again.